Hi, I want to make a vague concepts video, and in this vague concepts video I want to discuss two different words, and fairness and control. And control is obviously something that has to do with cause and effect and determination. How much control do we actually have over our body and our circumstances and our not just every single thing that happens to us, every single circumstance that we find ourselves in, every single consequence we have to deal with, every single interaction we have to deal with. How much control do we really have? And control can be attributed to things except for something that we can perceive. It's all about a perceptual sense of control and free will that we have. And I'd say to a certain extent we can perceive it in a certain way. We can perceive a certain sense of control over our thoughts and our actions, but the actions are it's just a stream of different interactions and of cause and effect. So I have an effect where I take action. Say something like my interaction based on my thoughts that led to a conclusion that which leads to an action. I say something which leads to another interaction. These closed off interactions, closed off circumstances, which I'm calling interactions. Like even though I'm talking or I say something and I consider that one interaction, there's plenty of other interactions and different contributing factors that have to do with it. But obviously, control comes from a bunch of different interactions. And to an extent, we have control over this vessel. We have a sense of control over this vessel that we're experiencing. But control, in and of itself, the word can be vaguely used to describe. Um, Control can be I have control over I have a controller in my hand. I'm using something to control something else remotely, or it's controlling something. Um, you have a glove on, therefore you're controlling the glove with your hand as you move your fingers around, as you move your hand. You have control over certain things. So it has to do from a human perspective, or a beyond looking at it from not looking at control as something less philosophical and something more practical. We have control over certain things and aspects of our life. I have control over the circumstances. I have control over how I react to the certain circumstances around me. I'm going to react a certain way to the circumstances. There's a certain preset interactions, and obviously there's things on the outside of me that have an effect on me, but I am pre-built to react a certain way based on this internal mechanism that created me and the circumstances that directly created me. So I'm going to react a certain way, even though there's things outside of myself that have an interaction that would cause me to interact a certain way. These interactions are separate from my being. So my being, this vessel, has a preset way of dealing when interacting with something. I'm going to react a certain way based on the circumstances. But those previous circumstances, the more you build up these previous circumstances, once this thing's existed, it's more based on those previous circumstances. But there is a pre-built-in mechanism, and there's going to be something the way this thing viscerally reacts to something or reacts in general to something. So the vessel I'm in, even though everything has an interaction on everything, I'm going to have some sense of control over, to an extent, these circumstances, because this vessel is closed off, and even though it is just an interaction that's interacting with the environment to a certain extent of everything around it, this interaction has a pre-built amount based on this vessel, this whole body I'm experiencing. It's going to react a certain way based on pre-built-in mechanisms and preconditions and pre-notions and thought processes, just based on my very creation. It's going to react a certain way, and I'm going to react a certain way based on these interactions that were pre-built into me and these preconditioned things that I was, say, born with. And it's going to react a certain way based on that interaction, even though my very creation is an interaction caused by another interaction and a whole series of interactions in the process. My control, to a certain extent, is controlled. Um, I have a certain amount of control to a certain extent based on this vessel I'm living in, or I'm experiencing in, based on my psychology, preconditions of my psychology, and how I'm going to interact. Say disorders I was born with, or whatever it may be. There's going to be certain conditions, creating different interactions and conditions and conclusions that are going to come from this interaction I experience. So to a certain extent, control can have a certain connection, but practically speaking, control has to do with more of an interactive kind of state as opposed to an interactive practical thing describing reality as opposed to something psychological or philosophically speaking. I don't have necessarily control over myself, but to an extent. I do have control over certain aspects, and it's a way of just probably better describing how you can apply words like control to certain circumstances. Because you can apply control, such as I'm controlling this with my fingers right now, yes, describing a specific circumstance. I have a controller in my hand, and I'm deciding to control, say, a remote control car. I'm controlling that right now, and vaguely that's the best description of something like control. But I guess it's probably not the best word to use when it comes to like will and free will. Do I have a certain amount of control over myself and will, and to a certain extent, um, yeah, um, you do to a certain extent because we're still moving into the future. We're still interacting on the same. We're still interacting, but this interaction to a certain extent does have it does have something. It's going to work a certain way and it's going to interact a certain way, and things are going to happen a certain way based on preconditions and things and other previous interactions leading up to the present moment where we are now, because it's all built upon the previous experiences that we're having. Um, I suppose control is a redundant word to use in one of these because I've already covered will and free and the idea of an I. So control is almost a vague concept, but it's more encompassing than say something like I and will. But I'm describing control as a little more vague and a little more broad than something like I and free and will, a free will that someone may have. So yes, to a certain extent we have control, but control is more used in a practical sense, such as I'm controlling something with a remote control. Practically speaking, based on interactions as opposed to intentions. Control can have something more like that. And then, the initial interactions or the initial causation of something, philosophically speaking, it's more of a practical use word. Which I would say in many circumstances, that's the way most of these words are used, is practically, sensibly used in describing practical situations in reality based on just simple interactions as opposed to intentions or philosophical discussion or anything like that. So it has more to do with simple mechanical interactions. So I'm controlling something with my fingers, that's a mechanical interaction, or I'm controlling something with my mind, say hypothetically, or I'm controlling a video game controller, or I'm controlling a remote controller. I'm controlling something to an extent based on an interaction, say in more than an interaction than an intention. So it's sort of like something falls on a button. That was sort of like a controller interaction causing some interaction to happen. So it's more like an interaction leading to another interaction. So control, to a certain extent, can encompass many things. But practically speaking, it has to do with maybe us controlling something else, regardless of intention or where that control may be coming from, or if it comes from anywhere, from some kind of being that doesn't exist, because the control that we have a sense of is based on something that doesn't really exist to a certain extent. We have control, but there's no control, and the certain extent that I'm making this comparison based on there's an I that control. So based on that premise, there's no comparing control to a premise that doesn't exist where I have control over something can't be practically compared to, because it's not something that exists. It can be compared to something like practical interactions. This thing interacting with something else to control something else in between, or I'm controlling this to have an interaction on something else, sort of like taking a process of steps to get to some final interaction. So I do this to touch this button causes this to happen. So it's just a series of interactions that that has this sense of control. It's based on a series of A/B processes leading to some kind of end based on an initial interaction, which is what I would say control is. And there's a control based on the very mechanism of cause and effect and interaction. There's control based on the deterministic mechanism. So control is based on this deterministic mechanism that's going to work a certain way. The very beginning, the first causal event, has control over the rest of all this stuff that's happening in the middle, leading to a controlled end, to a controlled conclusion. And that's what's happening, is every little interaction leads to every little thing, and based on that definition, that's exactly what's happening based on all these interactions, based on a middle, the beginning, and now we're in the middle, and then the end. And that's where we are right now in discussing control and things like that. So control is based on nothing but a false comparison, comparing it to something that doesn't really exist. There's no real control that I have intentionally. I can recognize that I have control over something, but there's no control that I directly have, because there's no real me other than just a bunch of interactions and knee jerks and things like that, jerking around and having just an interaction based on previous interaction. So the control I seem to have practically, or that I have practical control over certain situations that I can recognize personally in interacting with things, but control that I have over every single thing to some kind of initial cause, I can only do based on interactions and reactions that I have to certain things. So the only control I have is no control. I don't have real control over a situation because I'm just moving based on a bunch of interactions. But I can perceive control. And practically speaking, perceiving control is all that I need to. A practical sense of control is the only one that really makes sense. And that practical sense of control exists on the level of describing, say, a deterministic universe, and that's exactly what's going on. Control is happening based on the initial cause, and that's going to happen, and that's the thing that's controlling the very mechanism. The very first thing that very first domino that fell is the thing that's going to happen to have an effect. That's the control it has. Is the first thing that happens. Is the thing, if anything, that has control. If anything has the control, it's the first thing that drops. How it drops, and then that's the thing that has control. Sort of like my finger or my initial thought process, contriving some kind of beginning, a closed off example group, and a closed off group, and then you decide, okay, the finger is where I'm going to start the beginning, and my finger is the initial cause, giving control over the situation where I decide the end is. Sort of like me pressing a line of dominoes, and then I press it, and my finger is the initial cause that has control over the rest of the dominoes falling, and that interaction that follows is by the control that I have. But there's no real control that we have. And speaking of an I, an intention that we have on control, and that's only creating a false comparison and comparing the idea that control, but creating a false premise which control exists is not based on an intention or some kind of being. It exists on an intention, non-intention, just based on interaction, practical interaction. Just like everything that's happening is a practical interaction, that there's no me and no intention giving some kind of control to anything beyond my perception and my projection, which is just a byproduct of this crude mechanism creating me based on a crude mechanism outside of me, recognizing the crude mechanism that's happening. And just because I recognize it doesn't do anything, because I'm recognizing it inside the crude mechanisms at work. And you recognize the crude mechanisms inside the crude mechanisms, that's the only way you can recognize the crude mechanisms, because nothing exists outside these crude mechanisms. And so you're sort of stuck in the crude mechanisms, recognizing these crude mechanisms controlling you. So everything's controlling you and not me. So that's the way imposition equals control over me. The imposition of just these basic interactions based on an initial cause has control over me, leading to an end, to a conclusion. And the same thing can be applied to fairness, which I shouldn't spend as much time on. Just a brief synopsis of this. So fairness is basically this idea of how fair are we in this game based on this sentient experience. Obviously, like I mentioned, crude mechanism at work. We're just experiencing the crude mechanism. We're byproducts of the crude mechanism. We're victims of the crude mechanism after being byproducts of it, the sentience. Based on the byproduct of this vessel that we're living in. The body is a byproduct, and the thing that we're experiencing it through is this sentience, which is a byproduct of the vessel, based on a byproduct of the crude mechanisms, which allows this thing, this cause and effect that allows me to be aware of the situations and be aware of the pain I'm going through and whatever it may be. So fairness doesn't exist because to a certain extent we're controlled by these crude mechanisms, and since we have no real control over these situations other than just interactions based on all these different pieces and chaotic mechanisms and chaotic interactions interacting with each other, there's only so much I can do to change a fundamental aspect of this reality, and there's only so much I can do to change it. And there's circumstances I just happen to be in because that's the way things were going to happen, leading from one thing to another, and that's the way things were going to happen. So fairness, same way. Fairness doesn't really exist in this reality that we live in. There's just a bunch of mechanisms, but based on the sentient thing and the interactions that happen to have happened, we recognize a idea of fairness, which was created by, obviously, the mechanisms that allowed us to understand concepts like this. So fairness is about trying to make it an equal playing field. We can only practically make something as fair as possible by making things as equal as possible, say making sure we start at the same point or do this and do that, but obviously the circumstances aren't always going to be as even because there's too many variables to change those even circumstances, such as your initial cause, and you're not going to always start in the same place. Things are going to start differently. You're going to have a different interaction. You're going to be sicker than this person. This is going to happen. Something's going to befall you, and some interaction is going to happen to make it so that it's not as fair as it could have been. And that's exactly what happens. There's only so much fairness that we can implement in this world in existence. But fairness, to an extent, is just a bunch of interactions, and in the end, it's a bunch of interactions that means something. And obviously, this sentient thing can experience and understand some kind of fair interaction, and trying to make things as fair as possible. And practically speaking, this is a practical word too, as we could try to practically, based on our control over this mechanism, our very rough control over this mechanism, we can try our best to change the soil over the bedrock, but we can't change the bedrock. We can't change the fundamental aspects of reality. We can't make everyone the same, and if we did, it still wouldn't be the same thing, because there'd still be unfairness that led to that sameness. Um, and even then, it wouldn't be the same, because even if everyone was the same, that doesn't mean the interactions would be the same, because it's an interaction, a bunch of things interacting with each other anyway, and that's going to lead to some kind of interaction that causes some kind of difference or some kind of change, leading to unfairness. Change leads to unfairness. And that's what's happening. Whatever change you experience, whatever difference you experience, there's going to be some kind of unfair, some kind of unfair interaction that's going to happen based on the sentient beings, and the sentience is what creates this unfairness. And unfairness um, created the sentience. So we're experiencing things through this sentient mechanism, and fairness can only be applied to a certain extent based on our crude, our very soft control, our very basic control over this crude mechanism. We can only control it to a certain extent. We can only try our best to line up the pieces in line as straight as possible. We can only do so much, and we can only do it above the bedrock that creates the foundation of this existence. This existence, this vague description of reality and describing the situations in reality. Um, we can only do so much to change fundamental aspects that create the meaning of this sentient existence based on the biology, based on the crude mechanism. We can only do so much to change that crude mechanism, and we can only do so much, and we can just try our best within those rules of the crude mechanism to make the game as fair as possible. But in describing the definition or the word as good as possible and trying to make it equal for all things, we can only do so much to apply that to the existence that we're living, and we can't do we can only try to line up the pieces. We can only try to make people start from the same position, but we can only do so much to make the circumstances stay exactly the same along the same course, starting off at the exact same place, coming from the same exact circumstances. We can't change that existence. We can't change every single variable. And every single variable is the thing that controls reality we live in, and we can't do anything to change every single variable. Sort of like you can't imagine every single pore on your skin or every single atom or cell moving in the exact same way it is now in your mind, and describing or thinking about every single circumstance, or describing or replicating yourself in your mind and thinking about it. It's all just a simple projection based on as close enough of a real copy to the fake copy to the real thing that we're trying to experience, and we can only do our best to come close to the idea of some kind of fair game, and the fair game can only be reached so far, and we can only change the crude mechanism so much, and we can try our best just to mitigate against it. We can only try to mitigate, and we're reaching towards a zero sum, and that's where the fairness thing comes in. We can only try our best to mitigate against the unfairness, and we can't make the game fair. We can only mitigate against the unfairness. We can't make the game fair, because that would require impractical, impossible means of describing or making reality. Even though we can think about it, doesn't mean it's possible in real life. We can't make the game even, because we think we can imagine an even game, but we can't really. We can understand the concept of an even game where everyone's the same, moving the exact same way, but we can't perceive step by step how exactly that would happen, because it's an impractical sense. It's an impractical, sort of like trying to solve a conundrum with a falsity. You're lying to yourself. You're giving yourself a lie to give an answer to some kind of conundrum, or um, some kind of paradox. You're giving a false answer to a situation that doesn't exist anyway. So you're just giving a goofy or non-answer to a problem that it doesn't exist, other than a contrived problem that you decided to make a problem for yourself. That doesn't exist outside of your contrived existence or contrived problem that you created for reality. So there's only so much you can do to describe the situations, and there's only so much we can do to create a fair game. So I think that's all I need to mention. And even if I didn't mention everything, I can mention everything else in another video. So, when that happens, I guess I'll decide to make another video if that happens to be the case. So, thank you, and until next time, I guess. So, thanks, and bye.